Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Hugh Crumley. I'm Assistant Dean for Academic Affairs in the Graduate School. The event today is part of an ongoing series offered by the Graduate School entitled Race and Bias Conversations. This session today, by the way, will be recorded and made publicly available on the Graduate School website. So you're welcome to remain in the session visibly. If you don't want to be, you can turn your microphone and camera off. Note that only the main session of today's event is going to be recorded. There will be breakout rooms. This is going to be a highly interactive session. The breakout rooms will not be recorded. So our event today is entitled Maintaining the Momentum Towards a Diverse, Equitable, and Inclusive Duke: Challenges and Opportunities in Advancing Racial Equality in a Post-Election Environment. Our speaker today, Kimberly Hewitt, is Vice President for Institutional Equity and the Chief Diversity Officer at Duke University. She was appointed to this position in August 2019. Prior to coming to Duke, she served as Vice Provost for Institutional Equity at Johns Hopkins University. Ms. Hewitt holds an AB from Stanford University and a JD from the University of Minnesota Law School. Please join me in welcoming Kimberly Hewitt.
Thank you so much, Hugh, and it's a pleasure to be here with you this evening. And as Hugh indicated, I'm going to be sharing some information with you and also asking you to engage in some interactive activities. And so, I will invite you to come forward on your cameras if you're so moved and speak, or share questions in the chat as we move along. Next slide, please. So at first, I just want to offer some session norms just to think about, because we're going to be engaging in interactive activities. So the first one is just to focus on active listening and respect, and then commit to learning and accept that we will all make mistakes. And in particular, in this context, when we're talking about race, we're never going to always get it perfect, and we just want to accept that and avoid judgments, and we want to operate under the understanding that every person is capable of growth and understanding, which I think it's true and important for us to kind of keep our minds open to that concept when we're working on difficult topics. And then always remind ourselves to appreciate individual lived experiences. So you can never fully understand what people are bringing to their work and learning environments, because we all have unique lived experiences. So just reminding ourselves to appreciate that as we're working through difficult problems. And then for those of us who find it easy to share and discuss in a large group, just remember to think about the amount of airtime that you're taking. And then for people who are sort of on the other end of the spectrum and less comfortable, think about how you can challenge yourself to take a risk and offer or share something in the large group. And then again, just keeping that concept front of mind about the sort of ongoing and always evolving nature of this work, but really also thinking about how we can be strategic and create models that are sustainable, and how we can sustain ourselves in what can be challenging and we know is ongoing work. Next slide. So next slide, please. So I sort of have divided the one before that, sorry. I have 4 overarching sort of goals for today. We're going to spend a little time thinking about systemic or structural racism and how we define that. And then I want to spend a little time thinking about the notion of moving from being an ally to an anti-racism partner. And then we will have some time to think about some skill building and tools that we might employ in this context. And then lastly, just to think about some general information and resources that we should all be aware of, remind ourselves about as we think about how we can be good citizens of Duke. Next slide. So this next slide is just a quote from the statement from President Price on Juneteenth, in which we lay out this ambitious agenda around how we will move the university towards being an anti-racist institution. And I like to highlight this quote because I think it is important that we think about both personal transformation as necessary to institutional transformation, and that it's really important that we work on ourselves and continue to educate ourselves individually and personally as we think about where we're situated in the institution and how we can have institutional impact. Next slide, please. So again, kind of consistent with the themes of this workshop, I like to think about these, different levers that we have in order to impact change. So again, individual awareness, relational development, how that will translate to skill building if we're in the context of a lab, classroom, other aspects of the organization, all of these things helping together to create institutional shift. So the next thing I want to do is have you listen to a clip. It was just about 5 minutes. This is Ijeoma Oluwa, who you may know. She wrote a book called So You Want to Talk About Race. And more recently, she published a book called Mediocre, The Dangerous Legacy of White Male America. But she's a Seattle writer, and she started off blogging, and it then grew into this book. But in this clip, she's kind of talking about her own understanding of systemic racism. So we'll just take a minute and listen to this clip.
A cross on fire, right? And that is done on purpose because the way in which systemic racism works and has always worked has not necessarily been this reign of terror. That's more of an enforcement reign, right, of the system itself. Even in the post-Reconstruction terror of the South, the biggest fear was economic terrorism, right? People whose jobs could be taken at the moment's notice, whose homes could be taken out from under them, people who couldn't get any medical help, who had no security for themselves and their family, who couldn't get their kids to school. That was still the number one pressing concern. And when we look at what pulled people out of the South in the Great Migration, yes, terror helped push people out, but also the thought that you could get, when you read the letters people sent back home south when they came north, it was, you will have a living wage, someone will call you by your name, your children can go to school, right? These are systemic issues. But because the story that's always told in film, in television, right, we don't know someone's racist until they get mad and the N-word slips out, right? And that's how you find out. If it were that easy, I wish every person who had, who was prejudging and holding back people of color would just let a slur slip so we could know right away that's what we're dealing with and move on. It would make it all a lot easier, but that's rarely how that works. And instead, we focus on individual levels. And we do that because there are entire systems at play that profit from the marginalization and exploitation of communities of color and the distraction of racial strife that can't be solved that allows the general exploitation of all middle and working class people. And as long as we can't move forward on that, then there's always something for people to point at as the real problem, right? But it won't be racist to be upset that the employees of color that work next to you might be making as much as you, right? Because you're not racist because you've never said the N-word. And so I hope people understand that that's by design and that we have to actually be creative and we have to recognize that language was developed by people and it can be reframed by people and that rules of engagement can be reframed by us, and that if a word doesn't suit, we can change it. And if the definitions, and people get very upset that race scholars seem to have changed working definitions of racism in America, well, that's because it was pushed on us and we didn't have a say. We are the ones who get to say what racism is, because we are the ones living under its impact. And we are going to give it a name that makes it easier for us to combat. And we can all do that. And I hope that white people recognize they can do that with whiteness. They can actually start looking at what whiteness is as a functioning group, as a functioning power structure. And they can start redefining what makes them proud, and what is successful, and what is a threat. It doesn't have to be the language they've been given, but we all have to start talking about it and being open about what we've bought into right now in order to be able to do that. And that's where we're denied that. We're denied being able to figure out how simple it actually can be. And we're also denied in figuring out how many levers of the system we touch. At the end of the day, we're having these conversations so that we can figure out how the system works. I go to a high school and I'm having a conversation because I need educators and administrators to understand that they are part of an education system that is impacting students of color. I don't necessarily care how they feel about their students of color. I want them to enact rules and regulations that stop the harm being done to students of color, right? When I go and speak to police precincts, I don't care how they feel about people of color, but I want someone there to recognize they have a systemic problem that's allowing the abuse of people of color, regardless of what people feel in their hearts, and start enacting procedural changes to that system. And I need the people to understand that they can choose that. And when I talk to students, a lot of what I'm trying to do is let them know that they're a powerful part of a social structure as students, and that they themselves are deciding what the next generation of what is acceptable and is not acceptable is, and the power they have with faculty.
So with her words in mind, and so, there may be aspects about how she defines systemic racism that are new or that you disagree with. But I want we're going to do a think, pair, share, and it's not going to, maybe a bit more than a pair because of the size of the group. We're going to put you into breakout rooms with maybe 4 or 5 people. And I want you to discuss these 2 questions. So first, does the concept of systemic racism that is discussed in the video comport with your understanding of how structures of inequality have impacted communities of color, or your understanding of the concept? And then number 2 is kind of the $6 million question, which we'll be touching on throughout the next hour and a half. But what steps can you take in your individual role and or as part of a department or community at Duke to advance anti-racism? So we're going to share in the chat a link to the questions for you so that you can have those when you go into your groups. And we'll be in the groups for 10 minutes, and then we'll come back and have a discussion for about 10 minutes in which I want to encourage you to share verbally, but also feel free to share your thoughts in the chat. All right, well, welcome back. Feel free to, great to bring yourself on camera. And so if anyone would be willing to share a thought or a reaction to the video or something, resonant that you discussed in your share group, that would be great. And just feel free to jump in.
Hi. We were talking about, in relation to the second question at the end of our session, we were talking about the different things that we could do on a classroom level for teaching, including a diversity statement in your syllabus, and making clear that, appreciating diversity is, an important aspect of this environment in this classroom, and that, what won't be tolerated in terms of treatment of other students, and making the time and effort to include that in your syllabus and make that clear from the beginning, and just kind of trying to establish that atmosphere of mutual respect from the beginning. It's like one of the things we talked about.
Great, thank you. And that's perfect example of where you can have impact from your own sphere of influence. Are there others with thoughts? And I'm curious, every time I look at that clip where she talks about, not caring what's in your heart, I sort of have mixed reactions to that. So I'm just wondering if anybody talked about that aspect of Alua's definition of systemic racism.
I can
Hi,
speak. To that.
I had brought it up in our group, looking back on the politics of the last 4 years and some of the discussion about whether or not the president was himself a racist. And that could be a distraction when, regardless of what his personal beliefs were, he was implementing policies that had consequences that were continuing to worsen already existing inequities. And I do think it's important what somebody's personal beliefs are, but I think it's also important, what their actions are, what those consequences are.
Right, that's a great point. And I guess the reason I sometimes have a pause on the notion of, I really endorse the idea that we have to change systems if we want to change, our culture. And I think that and I find myself in this place that, trying to force yourself to engage across different points of view, and that it is possible for people to evolve in their thinking, and that necessarily is part of building community, but it's very hard. And in the work that I do in my office, I often just feel like I purposefully don't care about hearts and minds as long as people understand what is expected of them at Duke. But I think if we're really going to have this big picture transformation, we probably have to think about that simultaneously. Any other thoughts before we move on to the next thing?
Kim, this is Hugh. I'd like to offer a comment that came from Liz Milowitz in the library. She in the chat, she posted a statement and an observation that you might like to comment on. She says, one member of our group recommended REI groundwater training as a great way to understand systemic racism. Also, regarding what can be done, there are some challenges raised, including funding for hiring, outreach to develop a pipeline for more diverse students and faculty in the future.
Thanks, Hugh. I think now I've not taken all of the groundwater training. I've talked with the people who deliver it, and I've heard great things about it. So, I'm huge at anything that is in support of advancing awareness and learning is definitely a great thing to do. And there are, yes, challenges. And I would like to learn more about challenges in terms of developing the pipeline, but obvious challenges around funding for hiring, in particular during this time that we're in right now, where we're seeing constrained financial picture at Duke and other universities. So great feedback. Hugh, would you put the slides back up unless there are any more comments? Oh, I see a raised hand.
Yes. I would just say, in addition to Liz's comment, that as much as it's important to conduct outreach and help at lower educational levels to develop that pipeline, that one of the biggest things that we face in systemic racism, and especially here at Duke, is creating that inclusive culture here, so that once those ethnically or religiously or any affinity group version of diversity shows up, they actually have a reason to stay and find success, and don't just find continued obstacles.
That's a really critical point, and I'm going to share some case studies with you in a few minutes, and that will be an important concept that you can bring in people, we can change our demographic, but if the environment is not healthy, then we won't be able to sustain that. So that's a really important point. Anyone else? Great. Hugh, can you go to the next slide? So I'm going to talk a little bit about the concept of being an ally and thinking about how we translate that to being a partner in anti-racism. And being an ally is a concept that I think it's been around for a while. I've used it in my work for years and have often turned to specific examples where I felt particularly supported by an ally. So this is one definition. An ally is someone who's willing to pay attention to and take action around the social, economic, and political differences and inequities that attend to people based on distinctions of race, ethnicity, age, etc. And I think in the concept of being an ally is this notion of a person in a position of privilege providing support or allyship to someone with a marginalized identity in some way. And even as I think about moments where, I felt particularly supported by someone who intervened when there was maybe a challenging issue related to the Black community, so that I didn't have to be the person saying whatever the thing was. But I think that we are experiencing a moment where we're looking at race differently. And so I want to think about the concept of moving beyond the notion of a supporter towards being a partner in anti-racism, and so that all of us are really inhabiting this challenge. Next slide. So this is a quote from Ta-Nehisi Coates from a conversation that he had with Roxane Gay in 2015, so when he was promoting his book, Between the World and Me. He says, he's talking about, she's asking him a question about allyship, and he's talking about the importance of engaging in the conversation and how the conversation about race can be painful for everyone. And he says, I think one has to even abandon the phrase ally and understand that you are not helping someone in a particular struggle. The fight is yours. So, really kind of crystallizing this notion that we should all own this issue or this challenge. Next slide. And so this is our kind of 3 quotes from a later article in Marie Claire that Roxane Gay wrote, in which she's still contemplating this notion of allyship with respect to the Black Lives Matter moment. And, she makes these really, 3 resonant points. First, continuing on the idea of everyone owning the history of oppression and our history of racism. And she says that Black people don't need allies. We need people to stand up and take on the problems born of oppression as their own without remove or distance. And then the second concept is one we will talk about in the case studies. And I think I touched on it a little bit when we think about appreciating different lived experiences, but that it isn't, to be fully in the struggle, you don't have to understand what it's like to be oppressed for your race in order to do that. But that really the point is to activate people to think about how, like we sort of started in this last exercise, how we can participate. So, again, what's your sphere of influence and where can you impact change around racial inequities? Next slide. So I'm sure many of you have probably read or are familiar with Ibram Kendi, who has a best-selling book, who's a scholar and wrote How to Be an Anti-Racist. And again, we may challenge certain aspects of how his conception of this idea, but he really is foundationally talks about the difference between being anti-racist and not racist, which is very much aligned with Ijeoma Oluwa's notion of systemic racism, and really says that we should just disabuse ourselves of the notion of not racist, that all of us at different points are, without regard for identity or race or background. Sometimes we're acting in ways that are racist if we're, endorsing the idea that people are unequal based on race, and then other times we are acting as anti-racist when we're, doing actions to challenge structures of inequality. I think, his notion of being an anti-racist really is aligned with what we've kind of, what you hear in the quotes from Roxane Gay and from Ta-Nehisi Coates, again, thinking about how we sort of all inhabit this challenge where we're pushing against racial inequities. Next slide. So this is just a 1 minute from, I want you to listen to, of Coates in an interview, an Atlantic interview, in 2018, and I think he really sort of puts the fine point in only the way that he can about the notion of really owning or inhabiting the struggle against racism.
What is the price that white America has to pay in order to actually change these underlying structures?
A complete loss of whiteness and its suite of privileges. And I mean that in the most literal. If you want to make that not just, you know what I mean, an abstract thing. In this country, when I did Case for Reparations, and it might be more or less right now, but you had a 20-to-1 wealth gap. For every dollar, you know, that black people had, for every nickel that black people had, white families in this country had $1. Obviously, you would have to have the loss of some amount of wealth, you know, for the average white family in this country. Massive redistribution of wealth. But the money is just the beginning of it. I mean, you would have to come down here and live like we live, or we'd all have to be raised up, you know, to some sort of equal level. Trayvon Martin, you know, would no longer have to be just an abstraction to you. You know, it would have to be, you know, when Barack Obama said, my son, you know, if I had a son, he looked like Trayvon, that had to be true of white people too. Like, they would have to actually say that and feel that in a way that black people, you know, feel it.
So what does this mean to really own this problem in our context at Duke? Oh, sorry, next slide, please. So these are just, you know, 5 things concepts that I really think of when we think about ownership at the university, and certainly consistent with these 5 concepts are some of the examples that you've already shared, but, you know, committing to constant education and focus on the impact of racist policies and practices that create barriers to equity. So in everything you're doing, thinking about where do we see inequities, how can we educate ourselves better about them? And then, you know, relentless and active engagement in changing the demographics of whatever your environment is. So I think, again, wherever we sit, you may have some influence on the demographics. If it doesn't mean you're necessarily on a search committee, but maybe you're involved in some kind of governance structure, or you have access to someone who is involved in that process, or maybe it's on a smaller level where you're, you know, hiring a TA or whatever it might be. I think we all have ways to actually impact the demographics. And then, you know, constant learning so that you feel more confident in your ability to interrupt racist speech and challenge racist policies. And you touched on this earlier, examining how you engage in the classroom, lab, and work in order to identify gaps and inequities, and then creating a plan for yourself or thinking about how you can make a contribution to a larger plan. And when we think about, next slide, your role as a graduate student, the large majority of you are graduate students. So, you know, who are you? You're, you know, scholars, students, and then you're a peer to other students and scholars. And you will find yourself in that sort of bystander, ally, partner role. And as a citizen of the institution, or perhaps you are part of the student, you know, the student governance structure. Next slide. So, you know, there's lots of ways, in addition to some of the ones that we've already talked about, that you can lead from where you are and have an impact. And, you know, certainly when I think of graduate students, activism is a key. You know, there's lots of examples across Duke of where graduate student activism has had an impact, or, you know, changed the momentum or the movement in departments or in schools around how they address these issues. And, you know, again, thinking about student governance. So maybe even within any organization, if it's not student governance that you're involved in, one example might be thinking about how voices are being heard. And, you know, maybe you're noticing that there are some power imbalances that seem to align across race or gender. And so maybe you could think about how you create some more structure so that you're hearing these voices equally. Certainly there's, you know, the examples that were already shared in the classroom would be relevant. Thinking about, again, even how voices are heard and interpreted in the classroom, and depending upon what your discipline, there's lots of ways, and our current climate, where race can be injected into the discussion that's happening in the classroom. So you may want to think about how you're educating yourself to deal with that, and what kind of dynamics you might see that are happening in the classroom. And then again, thinking about where you have influence in terms of attracting graduate students and postdocs to your environment, and also thinking about where you can add impact in terms of creating an environment that would be welcoming as you're working to try to change the demographic. And certainly, in labs and in other, work settings that you might be involved in, there are ways that you can think about identifying structures that might be creating barriers to inclusivity, diversity, or just where you're seeing some challenges that could be related to race. So those are just a few examples about how in your role you can be, have influence or towards change. Next slide. So we're gonna go into breakout groups again, and we will put there'll be a link in the chat to a box that will take you to, I've created 3 case studies. And we're going to have about 20 minutes to work through the case studies and the questions. If you don't get to all of them in your group, feel free to prioritize them according to your interest, and then we'll come back together and talk about them as a group. But I want to just first talk through each of them before we go into the breakout groups. So if you could go to the next slide, please. So the first case study is about Jennifer, who's a graduate student in your lab, and she tells you and another graduate student, Joe, that she's frustrated because she feels like her PI is giving her tasks that are menial and not substantive. But the PI is a powerful faculty member who has a lot of influence in her field, and so she's afraid to talk to anyone in a position of authority about her concerns. So she tells you and this other graduate student, Joe, that she feels all of this treatment is racially motivated and negatively motivated because she's a woman, but she's not specific about that. But she's very worried about how this will have potential long-term impacts on her career. And so Joe immediately dismisses the idea that what's happening has anything to do with race, although he seems to be open to the idea that might be related to her gender. So you are the friend, and so I want you to talk in your group about how you might support Jennifer, what you might say to Joe, and just think about what systemic issues might be relevant here, and then what are some potentially broader implications about the climate in the lab. And we've sort of touched on some of this. So next slide. So case study 2, this is you again. You're at a conference that's held by some outside group, but really related to your field. And you overhear a conversation from a colleague who had recently visited your university, but decided not to accept a postdoc position that was offered to her because she said she, had a negative experience during her visit. And even though she was offered the postdoc, through some connections, she learned that one of the faculty members described her as a bit of a diva. And you've been very engaged in your graduate school governance structure and really been working hard to try to identify ways to attract more diverse students to the program. So you're disappointed to hear this, but you're also concerned about yourself, and you don't want to offend the potential faculty member who might have made this comment. But you feel strongly about trying to foster an environment that will be attractive to diverse scholars. So in your group, I want you to think about some ways you can address this situation and whether or not you have access to information about the selection structure in your department and how it's controlled and is it consistent. And then are there other resources that you can think of that you might access for support in a situation like this one? And then the last one, if you could go to the last one. So the last one involves Sean, who's a third-year PhD student who really wants to get along with the more senior graduate students in the lab, who often engage in banter that is sometimes off color and bumps up against race and sex. And there's another a PhD student who is Liam, and Liam is Black and 6'4", and he's annoyed by questions about whether or not he can play basketball and football, and says he was a chess champion and kind of a nerd. And this group of more senior graduate students think it's funny to ask Liam about basketball. And at one point, Liam gets frustrated by these questions, and then he's accused of being arrogant and aggressive. So I want you to talk about some ways that Sean, who also feels vulnerable, might intervene. And are there ways to address the hierarchy in the lab from a more structural perspective? And then just how do you think race might be at play in this particular scenario? So we're going to send you into breakout groups for 20 minutes. Is that right? Yes. And then we'll come back for a discussion. And again, get through as much as you can. If you just are able to get to 2 or 3, that's fine. Mix them up, not necessarily in this order. All right. Well, welcome back, everyone. The squares are still changing a bit, but I want to invite those of you who are the designated spokespeople in your groups to, obviously we're not going to hit everyone, but if someone would be willing to come forward and talk about how they responded to, we'll start with the first one with case study number 1.
I can go. Our group was talking about, in case study number 1, some of the implications of what it would mean for Joe to say, well, maybe gender is implicated, but not race. And really, I would just kind of press Joe about that. Like, have you seen this guy holding female grad students back for possibly years and you haven't said anything? Even if you don't think race is implicated, what does that say about the culture of the department? And then we were talking about how maybe you could just kind of get more grad students involved and survey them about what they've observed and what they've experienced, and maybe go through their emails, look at their resumes, compile a dossier of some of the incidents that they've observed pertaining to race and gender over the past years, and then maybe take that to administration so that they have as much written evidence as possible. Yeah.
Great. I think that I love that suggestion. Really kind of thinking about systems and the idea of where you are, you can gather the information and share it to have some objective information about how the climate might be negatively impacted. That's great. It's interesting because this is one where, and I'll let other people, I want to hear from other people, but this idea of not understanding for her why this feels like it's connected to her race is less important that you get that, just to accept it and then think about how you can have what steps you can take. Anyone else want to share any others on this one?
My group spoke a lot more in terms of the broader implications. We spoke about how the climate has been in the lab in the past and the changes that that can come from bringing this up and working actively as a group to make the change and changing it for hopefully, the people in that lab at that time, but also in the future so that this doesn't happen again and doesn't continue the cycle and try and break the chain.
So thinking about how this situation could be a catalyst to change other, issues that might have been occurring in the lab.
And going along with what Elsa said, and has this happened before? How many people has this happened to? Someone who does this once is likely to do it multiple times. So instead of kind of just being passive and, maybe validating Jennifer's feelings and speaking to Joe and saying, just because you don't see it happen doesn't mean it isn't, but also in the bigger picture of years down the line, this isn't happening anymore.
Right. So I think, both things are true, that we can impact the climate by thinking about systems and, what are the broader issues, but also individually, right? Thinking about so I don't think we want to divorce the idea of how you can be an ally in that moment, but thinking about it together. That's great. Other thoughts?
So our group focused on mainly what you just said about how you can be a great friend. And so some of the notes we made is to just provide that person a safe space so they can talk about the situation if they want to, and maybe not force them to say, hey, let's talk about this, but maybe just say, hey, if you do want to talk about this or recount the situation, I'm more than happy to be here for you, listen to you. And I think in that moment, it's very important not to force advice or try to fix the problem, but just validate what they feel. And I think the more that you can validate that person and what they're feeling, the more they're going to feel seen and feel like they're going to have an ally where if this does happen again, they have someone that they can talk to.
Great, great. So I love that. I mean, sometimes I think our instinct is to try to solve or figure it out. And just like listening without judgment and being a support, in particular, if you're not quite even sure what she's experiencing, especially relative to her race in this one, but to not think you have to, solve the problem. And even, in our work we do in the Office for Institutional Equity around complaint handling and responding to problems, we really focus on, the impact on the person and not, anyone's individual intent. That's sort of our starting place. How were you impacted? So that's really helpful. Anyone else?
Yeah, one of the additional things that we touched on, in addition to a number of the great things that others shared, was the need to be realistic about potential consequences, not to minimize or allow people to get away with things, but particularly in a situation like this where it's not clear what it was that Jennifer felt was, targeted to her gender or race, and the need to, who were some other people? Is there a department chair, other people in the institution who might be sounding boards if you feel this PI is not somebody you can go directly to and ask, why am I getting these tasks? What can I do differently? What is the problem? Given that there is the potential for, career damage if you make an accusation, that somebody who maybe has more experience with these things that you could discuss and try to get support them in that way by recognizing, if you're going to move forward, let's talk to some people who can give you advice or you can trust and walk you through what this might look like.
Yeah, so I think that in any situation like this one, there's both two things happening at the same time, maybe concerns about the impacted person about what could happen to her, and also potentially, the person who's the accused. And I'm going to talk a little bit about resources, but there's, lots of ways you can first sort of process what might be some next steps. Though, typically when someone is sort of like feeling, I don't know, we'd have to be careful about putting the pressure on the person who's having this negative experience to be concerned about reputational damage of someone that they feel there's harm, that's harming them, right? I think that's also just kind of a tricky conversation. But, you can do that by offering a variety of resources for someone to engage in as they're thinking about how might I address this problem.
Yeah, I think I would say, and I'm sure you'll cover this, Kimberly, the Omnibuds person, right? I think I have an initial reaction to the idea that this needs to be taken care of, like while the student is still in school and also going to a trusted department, other professor. Like there are very real consequences, and one of them is being shrugged off. So I think it's both really important to first ask the whoever you're about to ask if they are a mandatory reporter, if what you say is actually going to be anonymous. And I think, like someone said, keeping a documentation of the explicit instances so that you can use those maybe later after you have graduated.
Right. Thank you for that, Anna. I mean, these situations are very fraught for graduate students. And, we are continuing in RS to think about how do we manage the concerns that someone has while they're in their program. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is to really talk with people explicitly about what does retaliation look like to you? So like, what are the things specifically that you are concerned about that could happen if you bring something forward? Totally recognize it's such a difficult balance for people who are in graduate school. So I think the ombuds and other confidential resources are a great first step for people who are and you've got lots of resources in the graduate school in the dean's office and the other administrators there as well. So, and we're gonna talk about reporting a little bit too. So let me make sure I'm paying attention to my time. Why don't we, unless there's a burning question on this one, I think maybe we could move on to case study number 2. So this is the conference situation. Can anyone willing to come forward and talk about what they discussed about case study number 2?
I can jump in. Our group.
Just say your name. I'm sorry.
Sorry, yeah, my camera's not on. Sorry, my name's Hannah Ontiveros. Our group talked about. We actually came to like almost no conclusions on this case study because we talked about all the kind of difficulties of it, including that it's like. It's hard to bring up this problem like in any official capacity without potentially throwing this woman under the bus. And like it's not like she may not want you to like tell people this story in your department. And so that creates a problem. On the other hand, like if you're involved in your department governance, you can raise maybe more broad question and more broad like policies about like, do we need to have more frank conversations about how like the language that faculty are using, about like not only grad students need to be cognizant of like racialized language, but our professors need to be having those conversations as well and need to be having those trainings as well. So you could like perhaps use your departmental like governance to try to initiate that kind of conversation, and then also just continue to try to be involved and push the department to be doing like conscientious hiring, that, and at the same time be like if we want a more diverse faculty and we want to be making those kinds of hires, we also need to be building a like culture in our department that's welcoming to those people.
Right. Those are all, and you know, that's a great analysis because many of the situations that we see are things where someone does not want to go forward in a formal way. And so we try to think about, you know, how could we do something that's responsive to this problem without identifying the individuals? So what you suggested about talking about language or asking questions about process or thinking about where there's different avenues of engagement when someone is visiting, and what that might look like rather than honing in on the specifics in a scenario like this one is a great solution. Anyone else have different thoughts about maybe how you might try to engage with the person who had the negative experience? Kate.
Hi, I'm Kate. Our group talked about this from a slightly different perspective, because we really struggled with how we would do this if it was kind of a faculty situation and we were grad students, but we've all had scenarios where we've heard about students maybe being put in this situation where there's like a faculty member who said something to a student that wasn't great, and we've heard about it from somewhere else. And I think we struggled a lot too, right? We didn't come to a solid conclusion either, because we talked about how often in our programs, grad students become this informal network of, you know, trying to protect each other in these scenarios and being there for each other, but that also it doesn't always work when we go to the institutional options we have. You know, we've tried taking it to DGSs and we don't always get the best response, but that grad students in and of themselves are often trying to protect each other and be there for each other. So it's a hard balance of like, yes, we want to support this person and we will do our best to support this person, but I think sometimes we are left wanting a better institutional path to take. And because even when we do try to engage that faculty member, it doesn't always go somewhere. And it's hard knowing that and trying to reconcile that with future action.
Right. And, you know, one of the things that I'm hoping with these sorts of engagements, and, you know, these are not exactly, but sort of loosely based, when these kind of things do bubble up, you know, there are ways that we can think about engaging the leadership wherever it is to try to address if it's a structural issue, even, you know, not thinking about it specifically on dealing with the individuals. So even where these informal networks are happening and there's this sort of concern about coming forward, if there are ways to, if there is somebody that you trust that you can talk to. The other place where, I don't know if you're familiar with the Office of Faculty Advancement, but they are working regularly with departments on these kind of culture, climate issues. And so we work together a lot, and we'll refer folks to them because, they are also faculty members and really kind of understand the nuances. And so it can be scary, and I know there are always challenges, but we are finding ways to address these problems differently. And all of this takes time, but I think I want to make sure that you're thinking about that or aware of that. Let's maybe take one more comment on this one before we go to the last one. So there's a question about why the person with the problematic behavior is, and I only identified one of the three people by their race, but we are principally obviously the institution is concerned about diversity in all contexts, but we are sort of front facing, thinking about anti-racism as this critical issue in our country and at our university, and how we sort of tackle that problem as we also get better at thinking just like broadly across all identities. So I was intentionally focusing on race in these scenarios for that reason, because we want people to get better at dealing with these issues around race. I know there's 2 raised hands, but I think those might be old raised hands.
I was just going to add, oh, sorry.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I'm sorry. Please go ahead.
No, you're fine. I was just going to add on to Hannah's previous comment about potentially having a broader strategy for case study number 2. I mean, these sort of more subtle microaggressions and things that you hear and might not actually witness, but even things that you do witness that don't seem blatant enough to really take forward. There is a lot of peer-reviewed research that shows how implicit bias training and bystander training really moves the needle and actually changes behavior in workplaces, because you don't only need that person to understand and realize for themselves how that comment is taken and how it affects that other person, but you also need the person who heard it to have received this bystander training so that they might be able to call in the person that perpetrated that comment.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. I'm looking at my time, and I just want to take maybe one comment on the last case study, and then I just have a little bit more information for you before we conclude. So anybody want to jump in on case study number 3?
I can very briefly give some points we thought of. So we were thinking about things that Sean could do that were kind of safe and secure, so that because he felt vulnerable as well. And so we were thinking about he could change the subject and kind of just move things into a different perspective, and then maybe later on, if he feels comfortable, talk to the person, because often when they're no longer in that immediate instance, they're more receptive to hearing maybe how what they said wasn't the greatest thing. And then also maybe he could talk to Liam about the specific things that Liam is interested in, like chess was the example, but whatever it is that is not sort of the image the rest of the grad students are seeing him as, and sort of give him a chance to control his own image a little bit, but sort of be an ally in that way. And then also one idea that was brought up was bringing in a third party who wasn't sort of part of this particular group, so maybe a nearby group or something like that, who could maybe sort of be able to call things out, but feel a bit more secure in knowing that there's no repercussions to them. They're not part of this whole thing, so they can, if you have a friend who's just stopping by, they could say something, leave, and then, if the grad student doesn't like them, it's not really a problem either way.
Right. And I was thinking about there, probably in that senior group, there might be somebody who you would feel comfortable engaging about this dynamic. Stony?
Yeah, to add to that, we all felt like it was really important for Sean, who has the opportunity to make sure that Liam doesn't feel isolated with the way that he's being treated. But then more importantly, we all kind of agreed that graduate students can have a way of setting a culture in a classroom or a lab. And with something like this, which is, very obviously a blatant microaggression, like it takes some guts, but like there's a need there to make an immediate clarification or correction on what's happening, immediately, publicly, and professionally. I mean, of course, delivery matters, and so you can, just repeating what they said in another way. Said, is this what you meant? I don't understand. Or can you explain that? That way it forces the group to at least verbally acknowledge what it is that they're saying and how that might make someone feel.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great suggestion. So always the idea of when asking the question, tell me more what you mean about that, often puts the person in the position to have to defend, what is obvious racial stereotyping. So I think that's always a great strategy, depending upon how comfortable you feel with taking that approach. And also similarly, I think the person who suggested coming back to it at some different point where you could do that same engagement around questions. I think there might have been another hand, but I'm going to just, I have only about 2 minutes left. So thank you so much. I really appreciate your engagement. You've given me some good ideas for my own case studies. So if we could go just to the next slide quickly, we touched on some of these things. The one thing I do want to, could you go to the next slide, please? Is I just want to quick talk about the reporting requirement. So somebody referred to mandatory reporting, and we last summer and last spring and summer, we kind of went through this global review of our policies, and this issue in particular was one that we talked a lot about. We did talk with the Graduate and Professional Student Council. We talked with other faculty groups. And this isn't the entire definition because I was really focusing on graduate students, but this idea of responsible employees is really a concept that came from Department of Education guidance around Title IX issues, but we're using it broadly about harassment and discrimination issues. And we looked at other institutions' language, and we sort of took this idea of consulting with OIE versus reporting. And so the requirement is if you are a staff, a faculty member, or a graduate student, all faculty, but graduate students with some administrative or kind of supervisory authority, you're expected to consult with our office, and that means sharing details about incidents. And we have added to our team including someone who's really an intake person who can have that initial conversation with you to think about what are next steps that might happen. And then if you don't have supervisory responsibility or administrative responsibility, you're expected or encouraged to consult with us on these issues. So, know that all faculty are required to bring information forward if you're on the other receiving end. And really what that means is we want to have a conversation about what's the appropriate way to respond. And we rarely, if ever, would go forward with any kind of process without having a discussion with the person who's been impacted. So just wanted to make sure that you were aware about that. So it is 6:30 or it's 6:32. So I thank you for your participation, and my contact information is at the end of the slides, which I think Hugh distributed. So happy to answer any questions or talk with anybody offline if there are concerns that have come up.
Thank you very much, Kim. This is a great session that you've led us through. I'd like to thank my colleagues in the graduate school for organizing this. There's a group of us working on this speakers series, the Race and Bias Conversation series. And before everyone leaves, I'd like to remind us that we have another event coming up on Monday, February 15th. This event is entitled Discussing Structural Inequality and Systematic Racism Closer to Home. This is going to be an event that's put together by the group Women in Science and Engineering, that's WISE. They have a faculty panel. They'll be talking about structural inequality and systemic racism. There'll be an opportunity for discussion and also a meet and greet with some student groups. If you'd like to find out more or register for this event, you see the link there, and you can find other links for finding out about this event on the graduate school website. So as we wrap it up, please join me in thanking Kimberly Hewitt for joining us. This was a very, very interesting, engaging conversation. We look forward to seeing you at the next event.